everyone. This is Ronnie from Everything 5. I'm here at GDC 2018, and I have the pleasure of being able to meet with various people from Charm Games. I have Alan and Derek. They're both co-founders of Charm Games, as well as Dinos. He's a technical director. Charm Games is based out of Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada. And the game studio focuses on VR-only titles, so it's kind of exactly what we're interested here at Everything Vive to learn more about. So first of all, welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for having a chance or giving us the chance to talk to you guys.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Ron.
Thanks for having us.
Perfect. So first, I guess before talking about some of the games you guys have worked on and are working on. If you could give me a little bit about your background before Charmed Games. So just a little bit about what you guys did that led you here.
Okay. I'll start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you could just let the readers know.
Yeah. So I'm Derek. I've been working in video games about 15 years now. I started as an intern at a company called Radical Entertainment back in about 2003. Worked on a couple games there, some puzzle games, Hulk 2, Scarface. I was a lead artist on Prototype. So primarily my background is visuals, 3D environments, graphics, and shaders.
Okay.
After that, I co-founded my first games company in 2008. We were doing free-to-play web games. Worked at a couple startups after that. Started another games company in between. And then finally started with this company with Alan in 2015.
Okay.
I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the other thing is I moonlight for the last 4 years working at the TED conference that's in Vancouver, which is pretty cool.
Very cool. And I guess the natural transition would be to the other co-founder, Alan.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been working in the games industry for 6 or 7 years now, and before starting Charm with Derek, I was actually mainly working on the financial side. So I worked with studio founders and team startups that were doing stuff on all kinds of platforms. So I helped out a little bit on a couple dozen titles across mobile, web, console, PC for a little while. And yeah, we saw some VR stuff early on and got excited about the possibilities of it. I had known Derek from one of the places that we worked together at one point, and we were both excited about the opportunity coming up, so we decided to jump in head first.
What were I don't know if you remember, but what were some of the earliest VR experiences that you got to try out that kind of made you excited?
Well, I remember vividly the first ones I tried out that didn't make me excited at all. Or the Half-Life 2s in VR on the DK1.
I had the same experience.
I tried that one super early on, and I was like, wow, this is a long way away. And then I remember less than a year later, I tried another experience. And that one, I forget what that one was now, but I saw the difference between that and the new experience on the DK2 in less than a year. And that flipped the switch in my brain where I was like, okay, this actually is real.
Yeah.
Now, we're going to see some cool stuff.
And the fact that it moved ahead so quickly too, because I was likewise. I was showing people my DK1 when I picked it up, and going from that and kind of showing like every now and then you'll kind of hit a nerve with people like as far as or get people really excited. But other times there were people that tried that and were put off, and later on when I got a Rift and a Vive and the better headsets with the better software, getting people initially to kind of, well, I don't know, I tried it last time and it wasn't so hot, and then they try it, and literally it was only a couple of year difference, and they were like, oh my gosh, that was completely different than what I remember, trying initially. So it's kind of crazy how quickly this stuff moves. So.
Yeah.
Okay, well, very cool. And what about you, Dinos?
I started my games career at EA with Black Box, actually. So I was on the Need for Speed team, doing some pretty cool projects there, and then I actually transitioned from games to film for a while. Went down to LA. I was at DreamWorks for a while with the R&D group there. All the time doing kind of rendering, graphics, physics stuff.
Sure.
And then I left entertainment for a while, did some startups, both founded and was an exec at some startups in web and mobile and all sorts of things. And then had the itch to come back. So then ran into these guys one day at a VR game jam. And Derek and I go way back. We knew each other in high school, actually, or actually even earlier. And we hadn't seen each other in, like 10 years or something like that, and just randomly ran into each other. I was getting interested in VR, and these guys were just starting up and kind of needed a technical arm. And that's kind of how it came together.
Very cool. So, I mean, Derek, you had mentioned, you had worked on some puzzle games prior to founding or co-founding Charm Games, and maybe that was part of what informed your decisions to work on puzzle games. I'm not really sure, but if you guys could talk a little bit about kind of what your inspiration was in moving towards your first project.
Sure. Yeah, when I started at Radical, we worked. I was an intern on a game called CSI 2.
Okay.
So it was a crime-solving puzzle game. It wasn't like I wouldn't call it a real puzzler, but it had puzzle-like elements.
Mm-hmm.
Had a story. That was actually pretty formative, just in terms of how I saw like an ideal game team built, because it was no bigger than about 14 people.
Mm-hmm.
The production cycles were less than a year. They sold lots of copies, and they kind of addressed in a market that was underserved, which was a little bit more casual, but at higher production qualities from a visual standpoint and experience standpoint. So that left an impression pretty early on, and that still carries forward to why we're doing what we're doing now, is because in VR the wave shooter horror games are pretty well served for the hardcore market, and we're providing a service that it opens it up a little bit more and makes it more accessible.
Yeah.
Because that's one of my critiques of where content is right now in VR, is it's a little bit specified to an already well served market, and I'm looking for providing something a little bit different there.
Okay, and I don't know if that was also part of what why you guys decided to focus only on VR. Was it because you wanted to narrow and hit a specific market where you saw a need, or if you guys could kind of talk about how you reached that decision when you were founding Charm Games to focus only on VR, because that was one of the things I noticed when just perusing your website and obviously playing Forum, was that you guys, rightly so in my opinion, understand that virtual reality, if you're going to develop a game for VR, you really have to really be all in.
Yeah, I think that's the key part, is you don't ever half bake a cake. So you got to go for it. And we saw this as the biggest opportunity. It's not in terms of obvious. We're not going to sell millions of copies of the game right away at this point, but the experience and know-how what we're building is going to transfer over to the next 10, 15 years, and people can tell the difference if a developer is fully immersed in VR or they're just doing it as a side project.
Yeah.
The end result kind of speaks for itself.
Yeah. And what led you guys to make Form your first project? Like, what exactly did I know you guys had mentioned meeting up at a game jam, and what was it like kind of prototyping your first experiences in VR as a studio, and how did your creative process work that led you to your first title?
Do you want to talk about
where
Form came from?
Well, the Form, like as a concept, was just kind of a way of sidestepping some of the challenges of early VR development, like how do you move through the world, or what are you going to see next, and we were quite small at the time, and we didn't even have a full-time programmer, so we couldn't necessarily add characters or complicated traditional game elements. But within that, those constraints, there's actually an opportunity to do something interesting.
Yeah.
Coming from the simple concept of what if the environment moved around you.
Yeah.
So that was something that was pretty clear in my mind early on, because we had open questions about player input and player movement, and Form was just a first intro into maybe, well, we can't solve all of that right now. We're not an R&D company. let's make something that looks really cool.
Yeah, and I mean, and speaking about the visual style of Forum, I mean, that was one of the things when I first tried Forum that I was just blown away with, just in terms of like, and at that point, by the time Forum had released, I mean, I had a chance to play a lot of what I consider very high quality VR titles, but right away when I played Forum, like I was blown away. I was just, wow, this like just everything from it looked like the decisions you guys had made to the way you guys executed and implemented it, I thought was fantastic. And I didn't know if you could speak a little bit about kind of the varied styles that you see throughout the game, because I've being here at GDC, I've heard quite a few people talk about kind of different approaches to tackling visuals in VR, because it obviously lends itself to some certain challenges and certain things that work better in VR versus not. I mean, from what I noticed in Forum, you guys take an interesting approach in that it's kind of like you covered all bases. Like to some extent, like you have more realistic environments when you need them, but then you go more abstract when the gameplay elements also become a little bit more abstract. So if you could talk a little bit maybe about that.
I think, we made a series of early decisions pretty early on that we wanted to be playable by anyone. We wanted to be playable seated or standing. And from there, we kind of went off and went down the path of like, well, what would it look like? And the easiest way I would probably sum that up is we were chasing a feeling of what should it feel like. So it should feel surreal. It should feel ethereal. So the early visual references that we used was projection, light mapping, and performance art or installation art. So when you stand in these interesting spaces, it's not about the walls per se. It's more about these objects, artistically placed in a way that's interesting. And you can do that with very, very simple objects if you have that approach.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's a danger of trying to make things look too real consistently at all times. And one of the things that worked well for us is we kind of use the analogy of being on a stage. So traditional stages, the concept of being able to set the stage, in our case, is turning the lights off or making it quite dark.
Yeah.
So we have this space on which we can weave in different interesting looking things when we need it to.
Okay. No, and that's really interesting from my perspective, just because as someone that just enjoys the various games and experiences out there, but doesn't always know, the process. A lot of the language you used, I think, reflects a lot of the positive things that I see in a variety of titles, not even just Form. Like you mentioned, the staging and the feeling versus, like, to some extent, that really encapsulates, I think, what makes a VR experience so great. And
it's a magnifier. I think there's a potential to really multiply that feeling of immersion or feeling of being caught up in an emotion or something like that. So I think we've had a couple talks about this internally, like what the difference is, and I think we are not a game mechanics studio, we are a game experience studio, so that really drives the development and how we approach things.
Okay.
Because you get different results, I think, approaching it from either one. There's no right or wrong. I just think VR is better suited for probably on the experience side at this stage right now.
Okay, and leading off of that, obviously, Form, and as far as gameplay is concerned, mostly, a puzzle-oriented VR experience. What was it like to kind of decide the balance that you guys needed to kind of approach or seek in regards to difficulty versus, for example, with VR, if you make things too easy, it's kind of a blow-away kind of snuff experience, and you do it, and whatever, it drives itself. But if it's too difficult, players can get stuck and not move on. And so, how did you guys kind of approach that, and what were your takeaways?
Yeah, the main principle from the beginning again was the accessibility in terms of design. In the same way that we wanted the experience to be playable by anybody, whether they were a hardcore gamer or not. We incorporated that approach in the puzzle design too. So, we did fall back on wanting to make sure that people could get to the end of it, but we also didn't want to be really heavy-handed in terms of telling you should do this if you're stuck and giving you all kinds of really explicit hints or something like that. So at the end of the day, it wasn't really something that we set out ahead of time as a framework. It was just playtesting. We put 400 people through playtests through the course of Form, and we just shaved off rough edges as we got to them, and kind of got an intuitive sense of what players' flow would be from just watching people play it over and over and over again. And I think that's the right approach for VR right now, because not a lot of the lessons in design that come from console or mobile are applicable to those same challenges in VR. It's really hard to understand what people are looking at or paying attention to when they're playing a mobile title on the screen or a console thing, but you get much different information when you're watching somebody's headset move around inside a space, and you can kind of be like, oh, they looked at that thing and then they did that, so that this thing, that they're confused by this thing, and so there's a lot of that smoothing that you can do as long as you just put people in the headset a lot.
I don't know if any of these come to mind, but were there any specific examples maybe that you can think of where people were reacting to something in a completely different way than you thought, or you guys came up with a solution that doesn't seem so intuitive but led to the result you were looking for?
I mean,
There's
there are
probably
dozens
countless.
of those. Yeah, like there are so many things where the first time we made it, we're like, it's definitely going to work exactly that way, and then the very first playtester who played it would do it completely differently, and then every other playtester would do it in the opposite way we intended it. We had to change it around. I mean, there's not a single puzzle in Form that launched the way we designed it when we first sat down and talked about it. Every single one changed dramatically from when we concepted it to when we shipped, because of putting it through that process.
Very cool. And I guess moving on then, obviously you guys recently announced a new title that you're working on, Twilight Path, correct?
That's right.
Can you kind of talk about any lessons learned from Form that kind of changed your approach as far as developing a new puzzle title?
Well, I mean, there's like there's the internal lessons learned in terms of just how we go about and approach these situations.
Yeah.
I think at the highest level, the biggest difference that I think what we're doing with Twilight Path is because it's so experience driven, we're looking at this as a series of moments. So connecting moment 1 to 2 to 3 within a level, per se, which isn't necessarily the way that we designed or even discussed how Form worked, for example. So I think this is just a little bit of a byproduct of us getting better at internally preparing this, and then we're finding that there's a better end result at the end of the day when we're finaling a level, for example.
Okay, very cool. And I know that Twilight Path is a different type of environment. I know Form obviously was more of a sci-fi kind of ethereal type environment, and now you're moving towards fantasy.
Yeah.
What were some of the reasons? Were you guys just looking to kind of do something new, or what kind of inspired you to move in that direction?
Well, a couple of things. The first thing is we always really wanted to make games that had a broad appeal. And as Form, as unique as it looks, at first glance it looks like it's for a different audience for how it maybe plays.
Sure.
So that there's no right or wrong way. It's just that I think was maybe it's just an effect of what we have at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. With Twilight, the experience is pretty rooted in the same philosophy, but
sure.
We wanted to add color, we wanted to add, these magical environments, we want to introduce some fun characters and, unique opportunities to make even better moments or more impressive moments. So, eventually when we can show some of the stuff in Twilight Path, it'll be obvious on, like, you have a broader range now, so it's just it's a more interesting canvas. Not to say that we don't like Form. We love Form. It's just that's a very narrow way forward in terms of style. So we'd like to avoid getting pigeonholed because
Sure.
we think our range is pretty broad.
Okay. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if you can speak to some of the challenges and kind of expanding that, because to some extent, limiting the scope can kind of, make things a little bit easier in terms of control. And what are some of the things that you guys are kind of learning or working on in expanding and changing that approach?
Well, definite one is just the sight lines and what you can see when not everything's covered in darkness. So that's a legitimate challenge. We also are building these levels and introducing new workflows and adding characters and animation to it. So it's more complicated from implementation standpoint as well.
Okay. Are you guys still and this doesn't have to be specific as to Twilight Path or anything like that, but as far as you mentioned when you were talking about form, that some of your decisions, your design decisions around form, were also around the movement constraints, for example, that the current VR headsets provide. Do you guys? I don't know if you guys see any kind of changes as far as the medium kind of gravitating towards one type of solution versus another, or are you guys sticking with your guy? I know some people they prefer physical movement within a space and they don't want to get into other types of movement. I don't know if you could talk about that.
There are a lot of different kinds of movements that different people have preferences toward, and so far I haven't really seen the kind of cohesion toward the convergence toward one control scheme that, for example, like dual stick console shooters have gone toward. They all work the same way now.
Yeah.
For VR, everybody's pushing that way, but I haven't seen that.
Yeah.
And for us, it's such a big challenge that for a studio like us, we can't solve that ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? And so, we make decisions about spending time on the thing that we think is going to leave the biggest impact on people. And locomotion is not that, because we're not just going to sit not going to sit in our basement for 10 months trying to figure out a new locomotion system. Not because that's not valuable work to do, but because we're not the right team to do it.
Yeah.
So we're going to leave that to smarter folks to figure out locomotion in VR 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road.
Okay. Well, no, form left a very big impact on me, and I'm really excited to find out what you guys are up to with Twilight Path, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. As far as where people can reach out to you guys and learn more about what Charm Games is doing, what's the best way that people can stay in touch with you guys? And
I'd say go find us on Twitter at Charm Games. Our website's charmgames.com as well. And if you want to stay up to date on what's happening with Twilight Path, you can sign up for our newsletter over there.
Perfect. All right. Well, I appreciate you guys taking the time to meet with me, and we'll be in touch in the future, hopefully.
Awesome.
Thanks for having us.
Ronnie.